like to extend a very warm welcome to everybody who is joining us today from all over the globe by the looks of things. Thanks for taking the time to join us for our meeting today. My name is Sheen Towers. I'm currently the Director of Studies for the Metropolitan Study Group of the SRAA. And it's an absolute pleasure and a privilege to be hosting these meetings. We're joined by a whole group of friends in London at the Atlantis bookstore, the oldest occult bookstore in London. There they are all waving. It's great to see you all. Hi, Alistair. Hi, Mike, Alex, and everyone else.
Good afternoon, everyone. Very nice to be here for the first session of the year.
Yeah.
Hello, Jack. We're very much looking forward to this, and we're all rather excited down here at the Atlantis.
Hey, Alex. Thanks, Habibi.
Okay, so I'd like to, gives me great pleasure to introduce Frater Jack Kausch. Am I pronouncing that surname correctly? Is it Kausch?
Actually, Kausch.
Kausch, I beg your pardon, Jack Kausch. And he's going to be presenting on the topic of Imhotep and the Hermetic tradition. And so over to you, Jack.
All right. Thank you, Shane.
It's probably a good idea if you pin yourself
okay.
or yeah, have it set to pin yourself. And then when we open it up for the questions and the dialogue between us after your presentation, to unpin it and then set it to speaker view so that whoever's speaking will appear in large on the recording.
Right. Okay. It appears that I am pinned now, and I am going to be sharing my screen right here. All right. Can you all see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Lovely. I am now going to begin the slideshow. And you all should be able to see the slideshow.
Yes, very clearly.
Wonderful. Okay, well, thank you so much for the opportunity to come speak here today. The paper I'm submitting to the study group this year is a novel called Aretology, which was published by Star Lore Press. I would like to thank Victoria and Andre, who are here today, I believe, for their tireless work in editing and making the illustrations and putting this together. I'm so very grateful that we were able to turn this around as swiftly as we did, and that this novel has just been published. And a portion of the novel will be submitted to the SRIA website. I also have a link that I'm going to post in the chat where you can find it on Amazon. So please, if you would like to read the entire novel, you can purchase an on-demand version in the chat, and I believe we can put it in the video description as well. So Aretology uses fiction to explore a very simple question: is the historical figure of Imhotep the person who inspired the literary character Hermes Trismegistus? So we often think of Hermes Trismegistus as a god who is the amalgamation of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes, for those who might not be familiar. And yet elsewhere in the classical and medieval literature, Hermes is spoken of as a man, or sometimes as a man who became a sage or a god. So there's kind of a dichotomy in this historical figure. Sometimes he's a god, sometimes he's a human being. At face value, identifying a historical Hermes Trismegistus with Imhotep, who was the historical figure, might seem absurd, because Imhotep already appears as a character in the Hermetic dialogues, a series of books we'll talk about in a second, in the form of Asclepius, the god with whom he was identified. But as we shall see, Imhotep historically began a tradition of divine sagehood, which inspired other ancient Egyptian sages, such as Ptah-hotep and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, in Egyptian history. And so you can understand Hermes Trismegistus as a metaphor for the archetype of the Egyptian sage, an archetype of someone who has attained nous, or enlightenment. Now, I recognize that many of us may have heard the name Imhotep before, but it may not be entirely clear on the history. Imhotep was a historical figure who did live about 5,000 years ago. And you can see on this slide here on the right, that is a picture of me near Saqqara, the step pyramid, which Imhotep is credited with designing 5,000 years ago. And that's the first Egyptian pyramid. And he's also seen to have invented stone architecture. And later on, he became a god. So over the course of history, a real person who was a very important person in his own day for what we know of him, who was almost as important as the king himself at the time, which never happened again in Egyptian history. Over the generations, he began to be worshipped first as one of the ancestors, and then his ancestral cult became so important that he began to be worshipped as a god in his own right and became identified with the god of medicine. The second question that my novel explores is how alchemy, astrology, and theurgy were practiced in Egypt. And it wrestles with the difference between the Egyptian vision of the cosmos, of the sun, which circles through the underworld by day and by night, and the Ptolemaic vision of the 7 celestial spheres, which came after it. This historical rupture between two visions of the cosmos is similar to the crisis we face in our own time, because we've lost the Ptolemaic image of the cosmos and have a new image of a pantheist, ever-expanding universe. So one of the themes that this book is exploring is how the way that the ancient Egyptians viewed their world had an influence on how alchemy, astrology, and theurgy, which we call the 3 Hermetic arts or the Trivium Hermeticum, how they were practiced. But this is also a novel, so it explores all of these big topics I'm talking about through telling a story. It's the story of Hermeticus, an Egyptian scholar at the Library of Alexandria, who searches for the Book of Thoth and takes a journey south to the city of Hermopolis Magna, modern Al-Ashmanain, to understand the origins of the Egyptian temple literature. It is also a story about stories and includes different references to ancient Egyptian and Greek novels. It's a story about what was transformed and what was kept. What essential messages from Egypt still wait for us in the Hermetic dialogues, which, for those who are not familiar, are a Platonic flavored literature written in Greek. Now, the rest of my talk is going to give, as much as I can, a background introduction to the subjects of the novel. Now, this is a huge, huge topic. And in order to begin, we have to start somewhere. I want to talk about the importance of astrology to the origin of the Hermetica. So as I was saying, the Hermetica are pseudo-Egyptian spiritual texts written in Greek, some of which began to be written even before Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BC, which is not always that well known. The first texts that were written were actually astrological texts. And the most important of these books is the sacred book of Hermes to Asclepius. So you remember that Hermes is Thoth and Asclepius is Imhotep. So this is Thoth speaking to Imhotep. The sacred book of Hermes to Asclepius tries to resolve and unify the Babylonian zodiac on the one hand and the Egyptian deccans, which is a unification of Egyptian and Babylonian astrology, which is what gives rise to what we now call Western astrology. Thus, the origins of the Hermetica and the Hermetic tradition are connected to the emergence of the syncretic Western astrology. Now, you will not find astrological manuals such as the Sacred Book of Hermes to Asclepius in the Pomander, which Ficino translated, which we now call the Corpus Hermeticum. This is because it is contained in a body of texts known as the technical or practical Hermetica, which are texts which teach you how to actually do magic and meditate. The Hermetica many of us are more familiar with are the philosophical Hermetica, which are Egyptian Platonic dialogues about the nature of God. These are the ones that are contained in the Corpus Hermeticum. And for obvious reasons, the philosophical texts have been favored by the Church and the Academy throughout history, and thus they're better organized than the technical texts. They're more well known. Now, the sacred book of Hermes to Asclepius was written in Greek, but there are also texts written in Egyptian, which attest to the fusion of Babylonian and Egyptian astrology. On the right, we have an image of the Dendera zodiac from the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, which some of you may be familiar with. It is unique in Egyptian art for representing the zodiac in circular form and contains images of the 12 figures of the Greco-Babylonian zodiac alongside Egyptian images of the 36 decans, because the Greeks, in deriving their astrology, ultimately gained it from the Babylonians. So both of these texts, one written in Greek and the other in Egyptian, attest to the formation of Western astrology at this time. But what is often forgotten is that the first Hermetic texts written in Greek were concerned with mapping these two ways of dividing the night sky onto each other. So I want to back up because I know I've been throwing around a lot of words about the differences between Babylonian and Egyptian astrology. Most of Western astrology that we know today is Babylonian. And if you encounter astrologers, perhaps in the younger generation on TikTok, the Egyptian elements are usually mostly forgotten. From Babylonian astrology, we get the 12 constellations of the zodiac, in addition to the idea that fate is determined by the 5 planets and the sun and the moon, and the sign and house they inhabit. Egyptian astrology does not recognize the 12 constellations of the zodiac. Instead, it recognizes a different group of 36 constellations. Each one of these 36 constellations represents a 40-minute hour of the day as they rise over the horizon. So the Egyptian day has 36 hours based on these constellations. Elegantly, each one of these 36 hours also represents a 10-day week of the year, or decan, from the Latin decus, meaning 10, which add up to the sum of 360 days, after which a 5-day festival completes the year. So the decans represent 36 hours of the day, and they also represent 36 10-day weeks of the year. In addition, the planets are not as important in Egyptian astrology. The sun, the moon, and Venus all have astrological significance, but Egyptian astrology is not concerned with interpreting earthly events based on which constellation a celestial body is housed in. Rather, Egyptian astrology is concerned with theurgy, not divination. We will explore more what this means, but for now, if there's one thing I want everyone to take from this, it is that because 36 is divisible by 12, the Egyptian decans were mapped to each sign of the zodiac. So the early Hermetic literature assigns 3 decans to each Babylonian zodiac sign, and so we will have the first, second, and third decan of Aries, and so on. And the significance of these decans is still listed in astrological manuals, such as Ptolemy's Almagest. Thus, Egyptian astrology is hidden inside of Babylonian astrology and still exists as an obscure substrate within modern Western astrology. So it is important to understand that Egyptian astrology is concerned with theurgy rather than divination. Astrology for the Egyptians is not about finding information. It is about singing praise to the sun and maintaining cosmic order by casting the proper spells which keep the sun moving across the sky and keep the king and human society in harmony with the divine order. The image on this slide is of an Egyptian book called Fundamentals on the Course of the Stars. Only 9 copies of this book survive. While we can read the names of the decans in these books, unfortunately, the knowledge of which constellations they refer to has been lost. At each hour of the day, when the sun has reached a particular point in its progression across the sky, each decan calls for a different theurgic hymn or incantation to maintain the magical process of keeping human society in harmony with divine law. One can assume this would be the teachings of the priests of Heliopolis, as the theology of the sun is connected with the Heliopolitan Ennead. So maintaining the decans is of primary importance for keeping the proper hours so that the correct prayers and spells for the sun can be performed. I am now going to switch to alchemy. You may have realized that this idea that the sun revolves is very similar to the image of the alchemical process, which comes down to us from the Emerald Tablet. However, in that document, the revolutions of Sol are used as a metaphor to refer to the transmutation of metals. How did this come about? The recent book, Becoming Gold, has some answers for us. According to Grimes, alchemy also had a theurgic function and was connected with the construction of statues in temples dedicated to the god Min in Akhmin. According to Grimes, the Egyptian alchemists were aware that they could not turn lead into gold. Rather, the purpose of Egyptian alchemy was to dye metals and produce products like faience and gold leaf. But this does not mean that Egyptian alchemy was entirely exoteric. Color and precious stones had a very important theurgic function and energy. For instance, the Egyptian faience, the first artificial ultramarine pigment, is a way of creating a color with immense spiritual significance for the Egyptians in the adornment of sacred artifacts. I have something here that says painted in Egyptian faience, actually. I don't know if you can all see that. It's this craft of creating dyes for metal was a way to achieve the same theurgic effect of more precious stones at cost. And this is what leads to the complex metaphorical language that we remember as transmutation. Now, the ultimate theurgic purpose of all of this is to ensoul statues by means of dye and faience. And the ritual for ensoling a statue is identical to the one for ensoling a mummy, which is a ritual that is called the opening of the mouth ritual. You can see a picture of it here in the upper right corner. Now, I want to make this connection that this is the ritual which is also mentioned in the Asclepius when conjuring spirits into statues is spoken of. It is the ritual of bringing the Ba soul down into a representation of the person concerned. So we should be able to see now that alchemy is a theurgic process with some of the highest theological implications in Egyptian religion. But to understand how alchemy and astrology are linked in theurgy, we must turn to a tradition of texts which have been called the Bible of ancient Egyptian religion. Now, I hesitate to gloss over this briefly. This book is very important. We've mistakenly called it the Book of the Dead, but it is not actually a book. It is a collection of spells. Originally, it was intended for the funeral of the king, but it is also concerned with the revolutions of Ra or Sol through the underworld. As the bark of Ra approaches various stations or deccans in his journey, certain spells must be spoken. In the New Kingdom, this even evolved into a book of 12 gates, which alchemists will recognize as being similar to Sir George Ripley's 12 gates. A little bit more about this text. These are some photos I took of the earliest version of this text ever written. So it was not originally written as a book. It was inscribed in stone inside the walls of a pyramid, a very specific pyramid, the Pyramid of Unas, which you can see on the left, which is located at Saqqara. I highly recommend this pyramid. It's one of my favorite pyramids. And we know that these spells probably existed before Unas, but this is the first time they were written down. So if you're ever in Egypt at Saqqara and get a chance, do go to the Pyramid of Unas because it's a very, very important place. Could I ask whoever is unmuted to please mute their microphone? After Unas, these spells would evolve into many different texts, eventually being written in book form. I maintain that we have almost completely misinterpreted the essential functions of this collection of spells, but I would like to submit that it is built on the cycle of deccans represented by Egyptian astrology. It's not a book, but a collection of theurgic incantations, and that the alchemical practice represents the survival of these practices into modern times, transformed into metallurgy and science by the priesthood of Min. So the essential message I'm trying to say here is that if you read these central texts in Egyptian religion, you can see that all three Hermetic arts were originally one. The spells for keeping the sun going across the sky are connected with alchemical rituals for ensouling statues, which are connected to astrology and the decans. Now that we've established the relationship the Hermetica and astrology have to the core, the esoteric core of Egyptian religion, I will be discussing the historical figure of Imhotep. You can see him here on the slide. He's the guy on the left, and the guy on the right is another guy, Amenhotep, son of Hapu. But this is really a story about how Imhotep was remembered during the Ptolemaic or the Greek period of Egyptian history. It's not really about the historical Imhotep. There are a few important cults at that time that participated in the identification of Imhotep with Thoth at the time the Hermetica were being written, because Imhotep was traditionally more closely connected with Ptah, because Imhotep was a local figure from the city of Memphis, and Ptah is the god of Memphis. So it wasn't until the Greek period that you see Imhotep being associated with Thoth. Now, of these cults, of these religious orders, I should say, the most important order was the Ibis cult at Saqqara, which is the necropolis which Imhotep originally designed, where also the Pyramid of Unas is located. The Ibis cult is the cult which first applied the epithet the Great, the Great, the Great to Thoth in Egyptian. So this is the first time we have, this is the meaning of Trismegistus. I should have said at the beginning, Trismegistus means thrice greatest, 3 times great. And this is the first time we see that epithet written in Egyptian, recorded on an ostracon in the archive of a priest named Hor. Thus, they created the name Trismegistus, but they also began the practice of making an offering of an ibis to Imhotep at Saqqara. And the ibis is the bird that is sacred to the god Thoth. So they also identified Imhotep with Thoth at this time, which was a new identification. He was not usually associated with Thoth. Now, another important religious order is the cult of Amenhotep, son of Hapu, at Deir el-Bahri. Now, he is another famous sage who became a god. He was the designer of the Temple of Karnak in Thebes, and he lived about 1500 years after Imhotep. So there's a long stretch of history between them. They identified this chapel at Deir el-Bahri, identified their god Amenhotep with Imhotep in order to increase his importance. These two cults had an influence on the Temple of Thoth at Hermopolis Magna, located directly between Lower and Upper Egypt. And thus, because the Ibis cult had identified Thoth with Imhotep, and the cult of Deir el-Bahri had identified Imhotep and Amenhotep, son of Hapu, all 3 figures began to be worshipped in shrines at Hermopolis Magna. So Imhotep and Amenhotep were worshipped simultaneously as men who had become gods, and also as aspects of Thoth. And this is how the unique figure of Hermes Trismegistus comes into being, as being someone who's simultaneously a man and a god. Now, you can't go into this chapel at Deir el-Bahri near Thebes. It's locked currently. But in the basement of the Manchester Museum, the curator, Dr. Campbell Price, whose Twitter handle is there on the slide, recently discovered plaster casts of this temple. And I went there and visited him, and he showed me these casts in the basement. So these are my pictures. And this is a very, very fascinating chapel. Of great importance to my novel is that Imhotep's mother and sister or wife, Chereduach and Renpet-Neferet, these 2 women, are also depicted as goddesses. Now, there are several things about the iconography of this chapel that are very, very strange and unique in Egyptian art. For instance, if you look on the right, you can see this sea of stars that's located inside the hieroglyph for city. So the people who made this chapel were really experimenting with how Egyptian writing should be created and how it interacts with art. And if you want to hear more about this, follow Dr. Campbell Price on Twitter. I think at some point they may even turn this into an exhibit, which will be very exciting. And another thing I forgot to mention on this slide is that this book by Wouter Hanegraaff, Hermetic Spirituality and the Historical Imagination, Wouter Hanegraaff, the great scholar of Hermeticism from Amsterdam, also mentions this chapel briefly. So the importance of this chapel for the emergence of the Hermetic tradition is increasingly being recognized. And I would encourage you, if this exhibit in Manchester does materialize, to head on up there or over there and take a visit. All right, and now I'm going to talk a little bit about literature. I want to talk about some of the novels and texts about Imhotep, which survive from the time that my novel is set in, from the time when the Greeks ruled Egypt. The title of my novel, Aretology, is based on a fascinating text from the Oxyrhynchus papyri called the Aretology of Imhotep. An Aretology is a hymn of praise extolling the virtues of a god. Several to the goddess Isis have survived, but history has not treated Imhotep so fairly. What's frustrating about the Aretology of Imhotep is that it just contains the introduction to the text and cuts off right before he's about to tell you the great story, which was one of the inspirations for my writing this book, was to imagine what might that story have been like. So there is also an unpublished book called The Book of Imhotep, which no one has ever read except Kim Ryholt, because he's editing it at the Carlsberg Papyri collection, but you can read about this book. And that book also features his little sister Renpet-Neferet as a character, who you will recall is one of the goddesses from the chapel. There is also the famine stela at Elephantine, which is the sole document which really gives us the historical story about Imhotep's role during the reign of Djoser. It says that he cured a famine, he ended a famine by listening to a vision from the god. It may be biased because it attaches a lot of importance to the god Khnum, who's a god the text is associated with, but the story may be true. I mean, no disrespect to the priesthood of Khnum. But there's still there's a lot of self-aggrandizement in the late period. These three texts in late Egyptian literature form the literary backdrop which the novel is commenting on. And most of these texts are fragmentary or unpublished. So when I said this novel is a book about books, what I mean is that it's sort of engaging with the fragments of this literature and trying to resurrect it in a way, trying to breathe new life into it through imagination. The novel also comments on the tradition of the Sebayat, which are Egyptian wisdom books written by philosophers, sages. The genre is associated with Imhotep, and legend states, a text called the Eulogy for Dead Writers states that Imhotep wrote one of these books, which has now been lost. And another part of my novel is imagining what the Sebayat of Imhotep might have been like and producing a text which simulates it. As I mentioned, Imhotep's divine family appear both in the chapel of Der el-Bahri and also in the unpublished book of Imhotep. You can see them on the right here. There's Imhotep on the left, Fereduach, his mother, in the center, and Renpet Neferet, his sister or his wife, on the right. I have written about Renpet Neferet before. She formed the basis of an esoteric mystery play I've written. It's been performed only once in the south of India. It's called Achet, and you can listen to it at this URL if you're interested. It's an attempt to tell the story of Imhotep from the perspective of his wife. And this text is also part of the book Aretology. So in a way, the novel is a fictional story of this story, the story of the goddess Renpet Neferet and her role in the creation of Egyptian writing at the creation of Saqqara. All of these texts are considered and commented on in the book. But what is a novel? What actually is a novel? This is a Greek-Egyptian book, so I also want to talk about the Greek novels, many of which are set in Egypt and which my novel is unconsciously an imitation of. So you have Heliodorus's Aethiopica, Achilles Tatius's Cleitophon and Leucippe. These are very, very beautiful and famous books which are associated with mystery traditions and initiations such as the Eleusinian mysteries. Other important Egyptian novels which Aretology incorporates is the story of Setne-Chemwas, who's the son of Ramses II. And there's a famous story about Setne-Chemwas searching for the Book of Thoth at Saqqara. So all of these stories come together to go into this theme. And if anyone is really interested in going really deep into the literature, there is a book that was published by Marina Escalano Poveda, an Egyptologist, about this subject recently, her PhD thesis, The Egyptian Priests of the Greco-Roman Period, which goes into all of these novels, all of these books, which are just really fun. I mean, Heliodorus's Aethiopica is just a great adventure story. It's a great romp. It's hilarious. So, I mean, I'd highly recommend them if you're looking for some reading. And also, interestingly, these novels tend to be forgotten. But it was in this inspiration of the ancient novels as being a form of initiation, a form of the initiatic mystery traditions, that I wanted to write this book so that it could also be an initiation into all these religious concerns that have been completely forgotten that I'm talking to you about now. So I have come here today presenting you with a novel about novels, which challenges the way we interpret a literary and spiritual tradition. It's supposed to initiate you into the story of the sages behind the Hermetica and the way in which real Egyptian history became myth and legend, and men and women became gods. But we are contemporary people, and some might wonder what these events from 2,000 and 5,000 years ago have to do with our current struggles at all. So I am going to leave you with some thoughts, which I have absolutely no answers to. These are just thoughts. So I talked about this creation of Western astrology as a sea change in the Egyptian image of the cosmos, which is similar to what Giordano Bruno ushered in with his new pantheistic world religion, which is what became the modern era. Can the story of the Hermetica help us find a new image of the cosmos to bring nature and God back into alignment? Can it? Does alchemy mean more than metals and psychology? Does it contain the keys to understanding something that is not just personal or scientific, but also spiritual and collective? How can we create new images of emanation to replace the loss of the 7 celestial spheres? Because it's important for humanity to have a relationship with God. How can we, in our modern practice, integrate alchemy, astrology, and theurgy into one thing, the way they were practiced in Egypt? And finally, can Giordano Bruno's Art of Memory answer some of our questions? I'm not going to answer any of these questions, but I'm posing them for the society because I believe these are the spiritual issues of our time that this book is actually wrestling with. And finally, if you're interested in this, buy my book. Most of the material I have covered here is not in the book. The book is meant to be fun and entertaining. It's not scholarly. It's an adventure novel set in the time period I talked about, and used correctly, it will be a time machine, which will transport you back to that place for a second to watch the Hermetica being composed. The link is in the video description. Please do purchase a copy. And as always, fratres et sorors, thank you for your time. And with that, I will stop sharing. Thank you for the muted clapping.
Can we unmute and give you an actual clap?
Yes,
Jack?
yes, that's very good,
Well
Jack.
done.
Wonderful.
Very well done.
So shall we move on to a Q&A then?
Yeah, I mean, I actually was starting to write down questions. First of all, thank you, Jack. As always, so much scholarly information in your talks, which connects with our practical work as well. And I think those two worlds are often separated. And I think both sides of that separation can really get a lot from combining them. And I always love the way that you do that. So thank you. Whilst you were talking, I was kind of writing down a few questions, and then your final slide suddenly had all the same questions on them. So that's an interesting one, really. And something that you've kind of said you're not really going to delve into. You wanted to open those questions to us. So maybe just a couple of thoughts on those then. Questions about alchemy, and is it practical? Is it spiritual? Is it psychological? I think I've come to an appreciation more recently that it's all of those things simultaneously, because alchemy is essentially about creation. Alchemy is about the seeds of creation, and those operate in the plant kingdom as they do in the mineral kingdom, as they do in the emotional and spiritual and mental kingdoms. And so it's really that kind of process of learning how to distill down to the seeds of creation and then consciously, purposefully use them. You had that question about the kind of celestial spheres. Do we need to replace it with some new iconography? And I've recently, again, in the last couple of years, really come to this appreciation for the role that astrotheurgy has to play in the Rosicrucian tradition. And I was particularly grateful for you to fill in a lot of the ancient gaps there, which was a complete black hole to me. So there's so much there to kind of learn. But one of the things, starting to delve into those areas in a practical sense, that I really came to an appreciation of, is we don't need to replace the 7 planetary spheres, because you can stand outside and see them. And when you start engaging astronomically, not just astrologically, but astronomically, you immediately kind of put into contact with these ancient traditions in a way that is quite literally universal, right? So I think there's a lot of scope there to reconnect people. And we're starting to see it in a lot of the kind of esoteric work that's being published at the moment. The kind of planetary magic is coming back into full swing. A lot of these things are starting to be reimagined, made a lot more accessible with publications of things like the Picatrix in English and all that kind of stuff. And so I think there is something there that we can, hence my background, we can reinvigorate, because you can go stand outside and see these things in a very scientific sense as well, and it combines all of these things in a wonderful way. And then that question of the art of memory, all of this then starts seeds of creation, all of these kind of planetary spheres, all of this astrotheurgical stuff, alchemical stuff, all starts to distill down to the role of the imagination, right? And the role of the imaginative sphere in bringing things into reality. And that starts talking a lot about the spiritual role of humanity. And so, you know, a long-winded way, because some of those questions I wanted to ask, and then you put it all in one thing. But I think you've really hit the nail on the head there, that there's so many paths to look down here that start to draw in all of these influences into a cohesive vision of what these traditions are, what they're getting us in touch with, and then kind of leading into where it comes into Rosicrucianism as it's then kind of moves into the Renaissance and Enlightenment. But I guess then a question to throw back at you, since you threw all those questions at us that I wanted to ask. In my kind of explorations of astrotheurgy, I've been able to take it back really through the likes of Paracelsus and Ficino and the grimoire tradition, the Picatrix. And then you've kind of filled in a lot of stuff in the ancient tradition and then indicated that there's a lot of missing stuff. When does that stuff start to reconstitute into then what becomes the grimoire tradition and the corpus hermeticum? Where's that kind of another step that I can fill into that timeline? Thank you very much for the talk. Wonderful.
Well, thank you, Rob. That was beautiful what you were just saying. I especially love this idea of going out and being physically outside and looking at the sky, because I think so often now, because all of these apps have been produced in the last 10 years, so many people are studying astrology now completely disconnected from the actual physical context of the planets. And it's just something that they look at on their phones. And, you know, so I think that that's, you know, like tremendously important that we actually go out and look at the sky. And that, like you're saying, like, of course, this stuff is never going to, like, you know, go out of fashion. I mean, the sky is still there. The planets are, they're still there. They're not going anywhere. So, yeah, I think that's amazing. In terms of the historical question, yeah, I was sort of talking about the moment when Ptolemy's astrological system was created, sort of the backstory to it. If you look at, I mean, you'll be familiar with Iamblichus, of course, and you know his theurgy is really the link, I think, in terms of taking Neoplatonism and making it practical, and having an influence on certainly on the Arab tradition as well of astrological magic. I'm not too good on the Arab tradition. You might want to look at like Ibn Washia is my intuition. But so I think there's another thing that's very interesting in that, you know, this question about this gap in the transmission of the classics is that the technical Hermetica were passed down to the Arabs, but the philosophical Hermetica weren't. They actually came down through the Greeks and were passed west to Ficino by Plethon. So the Arabs, interestingly, like alchemy and astral magic and the Picatrix and all these things, all of the practical stuff, all of the stuff about actually doing it was passed down from the Arabs to Western Europe when it was translated from Arabic. All of the more like higher philosophical stuff that people tend to talk about, that came through the Greeks. So I think definitely if you're looking for the missing link, so to speak, the Arabs and also the Persians, those two languages are where that literature is written. And I think that a lot of the issues with reading those books, especially since, I mean, most of us will not have Arabic or Persian, is that it's not, no one's ever really cataloged it. No one's ever really brought it together. No one really knows. But if you're asking about the history, that's, well, I shouldn't say no one. There probably are people who've been dedicating their lives to this, but you know, it's still less well known, especially in the West, than what we know about in the grimoire tradition, for instance. So I think the Arabs really are that link. Yeah.
No, thank you very much. I think that kind of distinction you make between the technical and philosophical Hermeticum is really helpful as a framework. It's helped me kind of slot some things in that I hadn't considered in that way, and so many new sources now to go delve into. So thank you. Good.
I'm glad. Yeah, that's sometimes that's the goal with my talks, is just let me throw a bunch of books at you. I don't know if it's, maybe something will resonate, but I do think that distinction between philosophical and technical is has been made historically to kind of like push the technical out of the academy and push the technical out of the church. So I'm not always a huge fan of it, because I think that like this stuff is meant to be practiced. You're meant to actually meditate. You're meant to do theurgy. You're meant to practice this. So I think there's that label originally was created for people to say, oh no, we're not interested in actually, doing that. But it does help. It does help to sometimes have that distinction. Yeah.
Jack, any thoughts on the dominance of Babylonian astrology, how it kind of pushed out the Egyptian? Any particular reason for that, do you think?
I don't know. I think that part of it was probably the dominance of Greek culture over Egyptian culture at that time, and that they had been more influenced by Babylonian astrology for whatever reason. That in general, it's interesting that there's a dominance of Babylonian. That's not always true, because I think in the general public, people are more familiar with like the image of Egypt than the image of Babylon. But I think in a lot of our traditions, Babylonian teachings have tended to take precedence, perhaps because of their close alignment linguistically with Hebraic teachings, and because we come from an Abrahamic tradition, whereas Egyptian religion represents a more polytheistic orientation. Even though if you read all of the texts, they do talk about God as being one, even in the ancient texts written in Egyptian in the Sebayat. I think that might be some of the source of that bias. But certainly, yeah, does that make sense? I'm good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jack, thank you very much for the presentation. It was wonderful. I wanted to ask for your thoughts on this. That we've discussed in these meetings on a number of occasions that there is if you like, a new Rosicrucian Renaissance, which is happening. It's taking place. There's a resurgence of interest in not just the historical study of Rosicrucian theory and practice and the historical aspects of this, but more importantly, and I know that Frater Robert will be very much in tune with this, is what relevance is there in relation to now? So in relation to, we talk about obviously the Hermetic tradition and the Hermetic sciences. They've become really quite widely discussed, widely practiced and studied in contemporary society. I think specifically and particularly because of the creation of YouTube videos largely, and people being able to share information based upon their particular studies. So there's a lot of talk about like a resurgence in interest in the practice of the Hermetic tradition. But in relation to the ancient Egyptian connection, what are your feelings about the relevance of those traditions, those practices, in relation to the times we're living in now and the practice of whatever the methodologies may have been back then, or the god names and the archetypes? What are your feelings about the ancient Egyptian traditions and magical practices in relation to the times we're living in now?
Thank you, Shane. That's a lovely question. I think that Egyptian polytheism was traditionally seen, as I was just saying, as being the opposite of the Hebraic religion, because whereas the Hebraic religion is, Kabbalistic and about the word, the Egyptian religion is about images, and so therefore is sensuous. And so these were seen in antiquity as being almost like opposite poles. And the Hermetica represented this attempt to bring these two things together. It was Greek Egyptian literature, but there's a lot of Judaism in the Hermetica as well. So there was an attempt to almost like find a reconciliation between two different ways of looking at the world and looking at God that so often were at odds, were really clashing with each other. And that's what I find to be truly utopian about the Hermetica. And when you look at today, the great challenge of our times is how do we create a society where people of many different kinds of spiritual and cultural persuasions can live together in peace. We have polytheists and indigenous people who practice a religion that is very similar to the ancient Egyptian religion in the sense that it deals with the God as being present in nature. I'm not saying that they're exactly the same. Everyone's traditions are unique, but this is the natural religions of the world. And on the other hand, we have the revealed religions that have a different orientation to what religion should be and how it should be practiced. And this has led to a lot of intolerance and is keeping our global society from coming together in a shared understanding of mutual respect. So I think that what the Hermetica, and especially looking at the Egyptian backstory to the Hermetica, gives us is a way to have this conversation again within a Western context, so that Western people can be brought into both more understanding of our own spiritual heritage, which we have, but also being able to apply that to having an understanding that when an indigenous group says, this is our sacred mountain, to know, well, that is their sacred mountain. It's holy for them. We're not going to defile it. We're not going to desecrate it. So I think that this story is immensely important for realizing that kind of intercultural understanding that we need to really unify the world spiritually.
Thank you very much, Jack. That's a wonderful response, and I agree with you completely, particularly about the what I refer to as it's the great leveler, which is our connection with the spiritual sanctity of all life. Because for those who feel it, differences in cultural or religious background don't matter, because when it's felt in the heart and acknowledged, then it's understood. And it's the great leveler. It transcends all of those potential boundaries that would otherwise separate the various traditions and approaches or practices or names of deity or whatever they may be. And I find this really fascinating personally, that say the ancient Egyptian cultures, many of their deities were intimately connected with certain spirits of animals, and their connection with nature was vitally important to them. And I think that that's what we all need to reconnect with. And regarding tolerance and acceptance of the differences, rather than focusing in on the differences and as boundaries between us all, but being able to accept differences. And that's why I feel that having an understanding of archetypes is so important, because if we understand archetypes, which are universal, then we can pretty much agree on what we're discussing or what we're practicing, regardless of the geographical orientation of where that particular tradition may have sprung from, what point in history, what country, what language would have been spoken at the time. That the archetypes kind of are universal and link everything together, really.
Beautiful and well spoken. Thank you.
I have a question for Jack. Hi, everybody. Jack, lovely presentation. Thank you for sharing your experiences. And it's obvious that you've been to these places and you took, as you said, photos yourself. And I think very often we tend to kind of base our research based on, other people's books, other people's opinion. Looks like you've been there and done that. From your different voyages. Share with us what was the kind of the most impressive moment when you went like, aha, you know, out of all the kind of discoveries and the kind of places you felt, maybe energies. Share with us, maybe even with the story of Imhotep, or otherwise. What was the moment which was more kind of most impressive in your experience?
The moment that was most impressive. I think that the energy of Saqqara, the first time I went there, was incredibly imposing and incredibly overwhelming. You know, when many people journey to Egypt, they just see the three big Great Pyramids, the really big ones, which are very impressive. And I don't want to speak against them because it's, to the eye, it defies the imagination standing there to see these perfect mountains built by human hands. But in going to Saqqara, I had an experience of going to the place that was almost the origin of Egyptian culture. And you stand there in a place where layers and layers of 5,000 years of history have piled up on top of each other. And you can stand next to terracotta remains of a Roman temple, statues of Greek gods, and also tombs of ancient Egyptian philosophers. When I went to the tomb of Ptah-hotep, I was able to leave an offering at the offering table that was there. And that was an incredibly spiritually charged and powerful moment because the tomb is still there. It's still perfect in its eternity. It still functions the way the tomb is supposed to. And this is a testament to the power of those spells that they were put there to inter the people who lived there forever and to recreate their images forever. And when you're in that place, when you're standing there in the desert, in those tombs, you know, Ptah-hotep is one of the most famous Egyptian philosophers, and you're standing there in the desert there, that sense of eternity is very alive because in many ways, nothing has changed. The desert continues. The rhythm of the desert is the same. It will not change. And that energy and spirit enters into the nature of the tomb such that any word or offering that you give reanimates those images and makes them alive again.
Brilliant. Thank you, Jack.
We have there's a few eager questions at the bookshop, actually.
Well, then you go first. Jack, can you hear us?
Yes.
You mentioned Iamblichus a little while ago, and I guess a lot of us are familiar with his idea of theurgy and the ensoulment of statues and stuff. But I was interested, and my question is, are you saying that there was a direct line of transmission from the lineage of Imhotep to the Chaldean mysteries and Iamblichus, and this idea of the ensoulment of statues through theurgic practice?
Well, it's obviously what really happened will be very complicated, and there'll be lots and lots of people involved. But personally, I feel that Iamblichus, you know, is not just making up this idea of the ensoulment of statues. He's not just inventing it. And what I was talking about with the opening of the mouth ritual, that is the ritual for the ensoulment of statues. This is something that Dr. Price has actually been working on recently, is that you should consider a mummy a living statue, not just it's turning a body into a statue. It's the same ritual. And people haven't always recognized that this is the same ritual that you find in these earliest spells. So yes, I am saying that it is. He you know, Iamblichus drew from many sources. He drew from Chaldean sources as well. He also pulled things together. He also wrote a novel, or maybe it was a different Iamblichus who wrote a novel. There might have been two, but he pulled from these sources, and I believe he wrote a novel about Egypt and Babylon being married. So he pulled from many different sources, but I absolutely think, yes, that was one of his sources, with the actual ritual practice of ensouling a statue. And that is what we find all throughout Egypt in all of the spells that are inscribed on statues and all of the things that remain to this day. Yes.
Well, that's great. Thank you, Jack, because I have copies of what's the real title? The Going Forth by Day, rather than the Book of the Dead.
Yes.
I'm going to go back and reread those with different eyes. So thank you for that.
Good. I'm glad. I'm very glad.
Anybody else?
Yes, another question from the bookshop.
Hi, Jack. Just thinking about the association of Hermes Trismegistus and Imhotep with Thoth. One thing that most of us are aware of about Thoth was his role in weighing the soul in the hall, weighing the soul in the balance. Does that translate back to either Imhotep or Hermes Trismegistus? Is there any reference that you found in your research that suggests that they had the similar role?
Yeah, it's interesting because that's a great question. That's a brilliant question. There are the role of the weighing of the scales is connected with the goddess Ma'at, and the episode of the weighing of the heart. I think it might also depend on your theology. I'm not sure if it exists at the beginning of Egyptian history, but I'm not an expert on that. So you would want to go look that one up. But I think that it has different connotations if you're talking about the Ennead of Heliopolis or the Ogdoad of Hermopolis. So if you're talking about the religion of the sun or the religion of Thoth. I don't think that there's an episode of the weighing of the heart which occurs in the Hermetica, but there is a book called Conversations in the House of Life, which a brother in the Netherlands recently republished, that I will put in the chat, that has also has these teachings about Imhotep as being connected to some of these episodes in the Book of Going Forth by Day. So he is, in that book, Imhotep is the disciple of Thoth, and he relates to Thoth in a similar way that he relates, that the father relates to the son in the Sebayat, and that is another implication of all of that. So specifically about the weighing of the heart, I don't know. If you were going to find it, it would be in that book that was published by a brother from the Netherlands recently.
Thanks, Jack.
Yeah. Hi, Jack. Just want to repeat what everyone else has said. What a brilliant talk you've given today, and what a lot of thoughts it's conjured up. I've got 3 pages of notes, so perhaps you'll understand why I'd say, after I say, I've written a book of books, and what you presented is clearly a book of books, and I can see why you're trying to use one way of doing it to get across the message. A lot of people have done this in the past, and I decided not to do that myself. But a lot of my questions about what you presented today are probably going to be answered in your book. So I need to get a copy of your book. But as far as me and the SRIA is concerned, and your new Saturday college, is that I'd like you to consider breaking what you've done today down so that we can have meaningful talks about the implications of some of the things you said. So what I mean by that is, Imhotep and the building of the step pyramid is in one of the kingdoms of Egypt, which is completely and differently, psychologically, God-wise, and everything else. And this isn't a criticism of you, I'm just saying, so in the concept of that kingdom of Egyptians, we need to consider their beliefs with the Babylonians, which is another set of beliefs, and the Persians, which are another set of beliefs, stroke the Medonians, another set of beliefs, and their cosmological, astrological belief systems need to be compared in line with the Ptolemaic, or the Ptolemies, which were not Greeks. I mean, our Greek friends aren't here today, but if they had been, they'd be saying that, you know, there is nothing Greek about the Ptolemies. They are from Alexander, you know, and they were on the Ionian side, and the Greeks were in Athens and the Corinthian side. They ain't Greeks. They're about as Greek as the people from, what's the Isle of Crete, Cretians, you know, and we've got a fabulous group of Greeks in our society, and especially in Metropolitan College. And again, this isn't a criticism, but Soter I, the first Ptolemy, married a princess of the priesthood of the Samothracian mysteries. And so to talk about Hermetic Ptolemy Greeks, we're really talking about Ptolemy being part of, what's Alexander? Alexander is, no, they weren't Greeks, Macedonians. So effectively, the Ptolemies are Macedonian Samothracian belief system. I mean, so Soter I's wife was the princess of the Samothracian mystery temple on the island of Samothrace, and they had their own mysteries, whereas the Greeks had their own mysteries from Eleusis. Similar, but different. And this is the point about Egypt. You can't say Egypt, really, without breaking it down into the kingdoms, because there were different influences. So this would definitely influence what's going on. So I'd love to see what you've done and expressed, which is brilliant, in those terms. That's a request. It was what I would like to hear. But one of my theories is a lot of this belief system can be explained by calendars. And you touched on it slightly. The Hermetic battle that you were describing about the Ptolemy Macedonian Samothracian belief system that was now being introduced into Egypt, these people had a different calendar to the Egyptians. The Egyptian calendar of the main kingdoms was, as you completely described, 360 days, 5 intercalary days, the whole thing linked together, 10 days a week. The Greeks and the Ptolemies and the Macedonians all had a different version. I don't think the Greek calendar system was any good at all. I mean, it's rubbish, and when it was copied, the Romans made a mess of it. I think the Egyptians had the best version of it, and you touched on it. And let me just lastly say, I love what Derek just said. I love what Derek just said, and he was talking about a spell to make statues remain forever, which is my notion of heaven. I believe we make the best of our lives in this life, and that what we do is make a memory of all the worthy things we do, and they will be attached to the image of us, normally a gravestone, but in this case, a statue. And by attaching through a spell the history of this great person to this piece of stone and recording it, it has demonstrated that these statues, and of course these sarcophagus and mummies, have maintained their historical link to us by writing, which was an incredibly gifted thing for people to do in the ancient days. And through these statues and through these symbols, these things as memories are really heaven for those people 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, in that they're remembered well. Even if we're finding them now, we're remembering their greatness and everything else. And I think that's some of what you touched on. But I'd love the opportunity going forward to listen to you talking about the expanded version of what you touched on brilliantly. So many areas you are touching on all over the place. Absolutely fascinated. And it's great to see you come on board. A youngster of the study group who's turned into a giant.
Thank you, Alistair. I love that image of the statue. As
I've got just a quick question about the Babylonian period. It's kind of touching base upon what Alistair said in a roundabout way. was about when you're in Egypt and you look at the Ptolemies, and sorry, my WhatsApp going off, but you look at the Ptolemies and then you look at the pharaonic periods. When you're in those historical sites, and you literally, as you travel in different parts of the Nile, you're going through different epochs in the history of Egypt, and you stand in Saqqara, and it's quite funny because you hear the legend of Imhotep, and he's like a folk hero for what he did. Like the building of Saqqara must have been such a seminal moment during the pharaonic period, and yet when you get to the Ptolemaic period, it's as if they've tried to sort of suck the choicest bits out of the pharaonic period, but it doesn't quite feel right. And for the first time today, you've mentioned that the Babylonian period could be that is this could be that sort of missing link between the translation or the influence of the pharaonic period by the time it got to the Ptolemaic period, because it almost feels that, yes, you know, the Ptolemies, yes, they had sarcophagi, yes, they mummified, yes, all of these things, but it didn't, they might have been enthralled to the ancient Egyptians, but it just, there's always, I could never quite work out how they got from the pharaonic period and to the Ptolemaic period. So again, from Alice's perspective, it'd be really nice to hear a bit more of that, how that sort of the Babylonian syncretic bit in the middle.
Yeah,
Jack, before you respond to that, could I just say I'd like to just take the hosting back for the meeting so that I can moderate the questions and make sure that people are muted. So I'll do that. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Yes, Alex, thank you so much for that question, and Alistair too. I think I'm not, you know, I just came here and gave a talk with like a dozen books in it or whatever, but I'm not actually that much of a historian by trade. You know, this is a work of art that I made creatively to sort of reflect the history. I love history, but I am not. So to really get all of these distinctions between the different groups and how they interacted would take a level of, you know, history that maybe I wouldn't have, but I could do my best to maybe go a little bit deeper into some of these links and how this syncretism happened. Because I think really, to your point, Alex, what makes the Ptolemies different from the Egyptian dynasties that came before is syncretism, is trying to bring different traditions together. And so they start with astrology and trying to bring the Greco-Babylonian or Macedonian Babylonian astrology in together with the Egyptian astrology. And then they move on to trying to find harmonies between all of these different religions, because they are confronted for the first time of having really foreign rule over Egypt. And this is a very almost historically traumatic experience. So yes, I think that all of those things are questions I would love to investigate more, or even find ways that we could dramatize them through theater or through ritual that might make them more engaging than just a talk or a lecture.
Alex, can I ask a question?
Yes.
Right. But my question is, having been to Egypt and I love it, I was in an Abydos temple. Above my head was a tank, a helicopter, and a gun. And these were, and the reason being was it was Seti II's temple and had been overridden by Ramesses. So these these impressions above me were something I could understand. How often could that have been done in Egypt, where things have been overwritten by various pharaohs? So actually the original is no longer there.
Great question. I love that question. That happens all the time, again and again throughout history, is this editing and changing of hieroglyphic inscriptions. People will steal statues and reattribute them. People will take whole temples. And so it's actually sometimes quite shameless, where people will just chisel someone else's name in there and say, okay, this isn't Ramses anymore. This is Sefer-Hotep. This is my statue now. And I'm stealing the cult. And people make offerings to me now. It happens all the time. And then in the 18th dynasty, Hatshepsut and Akhenaten were systematically destroyed, systematically erased from history, and it wasn't just an attempt to erase from history. When you erase someone's name, you're erasing their chance at eternal life that Alistair's talking about. So eradicating the name has this magical effect of removing them from their incarnation in heaven. So that act was performed if it's someone who was so terrible, you had to not just forget them, but almost commit a spiritual violence against them to remove them from the world of the gods. So certain people like Hatshepsut and the heretic king Akhenaten were given that treatment, especially in the 18th dynasty, when there was a lot of tension between the priesthood of Amun and the royal throne. So yes, happened all the time, and it's fascinating, particularly in the Ptolemaic period. Especially in there's this one temple of Isis where an entirely fake history of the temple was made up that said this temple is 10,000 years old and all of this stuff. So yeah, all the time. Yeah.
What you just said there, Jack, 1 second, please. Excuse me. Thank you. What you just said there, Jack, about Akhenaten, for instance, having the people attempting to write him out of history, and they didn't succeed, really, did they? So no matter what they may have tried, politically motivated, I would say, back in the day, has ultimately failed, because here we are several thousand years later speaking the name and understanding what the persona of the individual that was way back then known as Akhenaten, for instance. They ultimately failed if they wanted to eradicate that name from history. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yes, they did, and it's actually fantastic. It's a fantastic story if you think about it, because on the one hand they failed, but no one spoke that name until about 1870 or 1880, when it was unearthed by archaeologists and translated and came back. So they succeeded for a very long period of time. For almost 3,000 years, no one said that name, and then suddenly it was recovered by a completely different culture and a completely different time. There was a book written by Jan Asman about this called Moses the Egyptian, which is about how even though they tried to suppress the existence of Akhenaten, the stories of him continued sort of in an encrypted sense. In the historian Manetho, there's a story about identifying Akhenaten with Moses, or identifying a king who looks like Akhenaten with Moses. So it is true, there was a way in which they tried to kill that memory, but it continued to exist even before his name was rediscovered. But I think the most amazing thing about that, and probably the most amazing thing about the fact that we're even having this conversation in English, is that, 2,000 years after the last inscriptions were written, here we are having this conversation about a world that is so far removed from us. And that is something that I think is really fantastic about our times that we live in now, is that there's been this interest in taking up the past as like a collective heritage of humanity. I think it's great. I think it's fantastic.
Brig, you've been very patient. You've had your hand up for some time. Please, over to you.
Thank you, Shane. Jack, thank you so much for a great presentation. Very, very thought-provoking. The Egyptian priests allegedly told the Greek lawgiver Solon, "You are but children, you know nothing," and that prompts two questions for you, dear brother. Is what we know of Hermetica a compilation of Egyptian thought? That's my first question. And the second one is, what dates are we looking at here? Because I understand there's much academic contesting of such dates. Thank you.
Ooh, yeah, great questions. I love this stuff. Yes, so that line comes from Plato's Timaeus, the priest speaking to Solon, I believe. And you find some of these sort of Egyptianate ideas in Plato. And so the question becomes, when you read the Hermetica, most of them don't really read like Egyptian literature. They read like the way a Greek philosopher would imagine Egypt would sound like. So there's always a question about, to what extent are the people who wrote these dialogues in Greek just sort of riffing off this idea of Egypt that was found in Plato. So for a long time, the consensus was these dialogues are not actually Egyptian at all. There's no Egyptian content in them. They're just like sort of pseudo-Greek philosophical dialogues. But Iamblichus says that when they translated Egyptian ideas, they translated them in form as well as in content. So they tried to present many of the issues that are discussed in the Hermetica about the structure of the cosmos and the different layers of reality are presented in a way that would be very mythological in traditional Egyptian literature. You don't talk about art like principles like Nous. You talk about figures like Atum or Ra or Shu and Tefnut, who have mythological sort of epics about them. So Iamblichus would say, well, they took those mythological epics and translated them into sort of like Greek philosophical form. So you can, if you are to read the Hermetica for things that are Egyptian, you're kind of going through and going, oh, there's that, sort of with a fine-toothed comb. And then the question of the dating, Isaac Casaubon in 1600 dated them to about the 2nd century AD. This was what changed before that. Everyone thought they were written at the time of Moses, so immeasurably ancient. Then he discovered, no, they were written in the late period of the Roman Empire. Ralph Cudworth, just a couple of generations later, I think in the late 17th century, redated them again, and Cudworth was involved in the Cambridge Platonists and has a lot of interesting Masonic things to say. He redated them such that that he said there were some that were written in the last few centuries before Christ. I think some of the technical Hermetica I was talking about, some of them have even been dated to 500 years before the birth of Christ. And then the philosophical, they're written over a 700 to 800 year period. The later ones are the more philosophical Hermetica, which tend to be written in the 1st and 2nd century, around the time when Rome was really experimenting with all of these exotic religions like Mithraism and Manichaeism and things like that.
Jack, thank you so much for that. Yeah, you've completely and utterly done my head in now. Many thanks.
I'm glad to do so.
Robert, over to you.
Thank you. Just a very quick comment, actually. You reminded me when you were talking about the Egyptian alchemical processes being about the creation of different colors. I recently found a really good YouTube channel, which I'll recommend to people, called The Alchemical Arts. And it's a guy in his kind of home laboratory that creates different color pigments using the alchemical processes. And so he then kind of sells these as watercolors and things like this. He's taking it more from a scientific perspective, I guess, but just fascinating to kind of link those two things. So if you check out The Alchemical Arts on YouTube, I'll put a link in the comments. I think you'll find that quite interesting.
Wow, thank you, Rob. Yeah, I feel like your alchemical perspective as well here is so important, because like we need to actually start practicing this stuff and taking it forward. So anyway, whether it's science.
Well, I have to put my hands up and say that laboratory alchemy is not something I've ever really explored or understood until quite recently, when I've started kind of delving headlong into it. But I know there are a few fraters out there, and we had a recent piece in our SRA London pamphlets about the Czech alchemical tradition in the modern age, which I would recommend anybody on the SRA London website looks up. There are a few people who have really held the torch of laboratory alchemy throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century in a fascinating way. But it was one of those pieces of the puzzle that I hadn't fully understood because I hadn't practiced it. It requires far too much patience for my liking. But then having that kind of realization that ultimately what we're talking about are seeds, and we know what a seed looks like in the plant kingdom. But when you start thinking about what a seed looks like in the mineral kingdom or the spiritual kingdom or the emotional kingdom, then all of these things start to come into a universal process. But there's a few people on there on YouTube now who allow you to kind of see what these processes look like. I think the kind of laboratory side of it has been demystified in a way, at least in recent kind of years, where people are starting to put this stuff down as to how to practically do it. Whether or not I'll ever get there personally, as I said, waiting for something to kind of digest and distill for months on end is not necessarily something that is in my wheelhouse. But I know there are a lot of Rosicrucians out there who have kept this practical alchemical flame alive throughout the centuries, really, and into the 21st century.
That is so cool. Thank you.
Jack, may I just ask a quick question? You mentioned about a pigment, and you said that you're wearing something which has that pigment. Could you maybe speak a little further on that that particular pigment, what its symbolism is, or how it was discovered, what it was used for?
Yeah, well, originally, see, this right here is a cube of lapis lazuli, which comes from Afghanistan. And originally, all lapis lazuli in the ancient world came from Afghanistan, in India or in Babylon or in Egypt, and they would trade for it, but they had to go through the Babylonians as middlemen. So it was very, very expensive. But it's a beautiful stone, and it has lots of significance to the goddess Hathor and the goddess of the night sky, and has an incredible spiritual power. They found it a stone that had great spiritual power, and it was valued alongside gold as something that they would put as inlays in their temples and in their artifacts and in their objects. And so because it was so expensive to trade for, because it's coming all the way from Afghanistan, they wanted to find a way to create a pigment that you could use to paint on a stone or on a surface to achieve the same effect. So they created the Egyptian faience, which was pretty much the world's first glaze, which achieves the same effect of the color without needing to buy this very expensive stone and grind it up. So that was the motivation for it.
Okay, thank you. Alex, over to you.
Yes.
Yeah, just a quick comment rather than a question. You mentioned Moses and Akhenaten. There is an author called Ahmed Osman who has written a number of books. One was about Yuya and Joseph, and one of his other main ones was about Moses and Akhenaten. They're quite interesting. I won't comment on whether they're accurate or not. I'm not qualified enough to do that. But I met Ahmed on a number of occasions, probably in the 80s now, and he was actually down to be an initiate into a London lodge. For some reason, he pulled out at the last minute. I've never found out why, but he certainly has interesting views.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I think certainly people have made that link between Akhenaten and Moses before. I think the first person to do it was actually Sigmund Freud, interestingly enough. Weirdly, you wouldn't expect that. But yeah, it's a very fascinating theory and idea and story that we want to tell, especially because there's so much similarity between the story of Akhenaten and the story of Exodus. There's a real, Osman actually believed that was the story that could help resolve the split between the natural and the revealed religions. He thought that story was what connected Egyptian religion and Judaism in the imagination. I mean, whether that's true historically, I don't know, but as an image, as an idea, and the idea of Moses studying the Egyptian mysteries has been one that's been very compelling spiritually for people throughout history. Anyways.
Does anybody else have any particular questions for Jack?
Another one from the bookshop.
Go ahead.
Right, another lady. My question is, having been in the tomb of Seti II, the fantastic blue on there and how it's remained for all those thousands of years, and seeing temples where if they're not in the sun, this beautiful colour is still there. What is the paint? What is in there that has remained all these years?
Oh gosh, wow, that's like a question for a real alchemist here. I gotta actually go break out the lab, I guess. Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea. And it might be the desert too, which preserves things as it does. But I have no idea actually what is actually in the Egyptian faience paint. And that's a great. That's it. That'll be my first alchemical experiment, I guess, once I watch Alchemical Arts.
Anybody else, please? Any questions or observations or comments for Jack?
So I asked Alex, and I just can I ask you again for clarification, Jack? One of your replies. Were you saying that it was the Greeks trying to rationalize the Egyptian thoughts, or the people in Egypt who were Greeks trying to work out the Greek thoughts? Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I think it's a little bit of both. Sorry to say it, but it really depends on your social context too.
Good answer, Jack. Good answer.
That's it's the safe answer. You can always give that one. No, but it depends on whether you're employed at a temple as well. Zosimos is really interesting for this because in the Becoming Gold book, he mentions how when they find the minutes of the temple where Zosimos works, he speaks in a certain way to fellow Egyptians that are more about Egyptian religion. But then when he goes and talks to the general community, he speaks in Hermetic terms. So there is a sort of like, if you're in a temple and you can read hieroglyphs, you're saying different things than if you're out in the public sphere. Probably originally, though, it was the Greeks who were making associations with Egyptian religion as a form of colonization. But then later on, the Egyptians sort of start playing with these ideas and almost subverting them a bit. So there's definitely a tension, and you do have to keep in mind that at that time, Alexandria was sucking all of the juice, the lifeblood out of Egypt. It was very much it's very different. That city never existed before, and it was very much a colonial project. So there are all these power relations involved as well. So it's complicated, I guess, is the answer.
During the Ptolemaic period, was there a widespread understanding and ability to read hieroglyphics, or was it just as much of a mystery to them as it was to us until fairly modern history?
But yeah, that's a great question. The Greeks couldn't. The Greeks, they tried not to teach the Greeks hieroglyphs because they'd been invaded. They were trying to protect what was left of their culture, and they actually made hieroglyphs more complicated at that time. So hieroglyphs, they start like, there's a famous text that's written entirely in crocodiles, and it's just crocodile, and it spells a complete sentence, but the whole text is crocodile. So only an initiate can actually read it. So they created all of these secret codes and cryptographies so that the Greeks couldn't read the hieroglyphs, because they were trying to protect their religion from outsiders. And that's kind of what gave the Greeks this idea that hieroglyphs are some kind of like woo magical language, because they were adding in all these cryptographic little funny puzzle games to it.
Well, following on from that, because what that led to, so are we talking about the Hermetic period being somebody trying to get the language right, because we're talking about the language of gods, the language of astrology, the language of alchemy, and whether to use the old Egyptian ways, the new Greek, because there was a huge, I mean, the Jews had a real problem with their believers using the Greek language. Now, whether that's the Ptolemy language, I won't even go into Ptolemy Macedonian or whatever, but there was a massive problem. And of course, allegedly, the first language used for the Bible was the not Samothracian, but Sumerian language related to Phoenician. So, well, you know, in this Hermetic period, we're talking, is it Sumerian? Are we going to use the Jewish version? Are we going to use the Greek version? Are we going to, was Rome coming on board? I don't think so. Let's leave them out for the time being, which is great. And what language were the Egyptians using? Were they using Old Egyptian, or were they using New Ptolemy language? I mean, this seems, this is why there's so much more to what you brought today that I'd love to talk about. And language is another one, as well as gods, astrology, astronomy, everything. You know, it seems to be all in the air there, doesn't it? Asking you the question, what do you think?
Yes, definitely, totally. There we go. That's it. It's answered. But they do start to write in the Demotic language, because they have like 4 different alphabets, and they keep inventing new alphabets. So lots of things with writing too. The Egyptians are doing at this time. Yeah, who knows? Late antiquity is a huge time of intercultural exchange, isn't it? And that's how we got Christianity, really, is that everyone was exchanging ideas. So, but Koine being the common language, I think there is a pressure between, you know, things that are put in Koine Greek and things that are kept for insiders. And yeah, I think you're right. The Jews do have a similar tension in their communities as well. And there's a large community of Jews in Alexandria. You know, there's a massive, you know, so that some people even think they were very, Philo of Alexandria, some people think was very important in putting together the Hermetica. So gosh, there is just so much detail that we could go into, and we could pull out 10,000 old books, and then yeah, we could never end. Yeah.
So, Jack, could you please just remind people of how they can obtain a copy of your book?
Yes, so you can buy it on Amazon, and I will put it here in the Zoom chat right there. And I suppose we could also put that in the video description. put it out in email.
Yeah, thank you, Jack. We'll make sure that that is in the video description, obviously. And has anybody else got any particular questions for Jack?
I just wanted to say thanks to Jack, first of all, for the marvelous presentation and being allowed to be a participant in it. But this was more a comment with regards to the lady in the Atlantis bookshop. I apologize, my dear, I don't know your name. But with regards to the blue from the lapis lazuli and them creating their color, and also the Hebrews having that particular blue, which is in their ceremonial robes, and whether there's a relationship with that, because obviously you've mentioned Akhenaten and Moses being together, and the comparisons with the two, and that blue carrying from both. And something that I'm going to have to look into with regards to the alchemical side that Rob mentioned as well. So I'm just good food for thought. So thank you.
Lovely.
Thank you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jack. Jeff, I beg your pardon. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, any final words, Jack?
No, just thank you all so much for showing up and listening to all of this. I absolutely love this material. That's why I wrote a novel about it. It would mean a lot if you, bought my book and gave it a read. It's a fun little adventure romp, and I really enjoyed writing it. And thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you, Jack. And yeah, maybe over to the people at the Atlantis bookstore. If you want to say any words of thanks to Jack, please go ahead.
Well, I just think on behalf of everybody here, we've had an absolutely fantastic afternoon, Jack. We are fully inspired, and I'm sure the lively conversation is going to continue for the next few hours. So thank you for giving us a wonderful choice of subject to chew the cud on a Saturday afternoon. So thank you from everyone here.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoy.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed, Jack. And yeah, I wish you a wonderful day. And yeah, all the best with your studies in London, in Ontario, isn't it?
Yes, that's right. The other London. Thank you.
The other London. Yeah, wishing you all the best.
As well. Farewell.
Thank you, everybody.